an Epiphone Olympic. First one I've ever seen. This is a product from long before Epiphone was a down-market import brand. This is Epiphone in its heyday, when they were handcrafted in Long Island City. 1930s Epiphone archtops were seen by players of the time as equal to or sometimes surpassing Gibsons, especially the full-size jazz boxes. This is a wee little fellow, however, and I believe it's from 1935. I say wee, but it's not actually as wee as it could be, because if it was made in 1934, it would only be 13 inches across the lower bout, rather than the more spacious 14.5 that we have here. The Olympic these days is mostly associated with a single player, and that is David Rawlings, the accompanist to Gillian Welch. It's the sound. He's got a lot of people who really love his playing, and as a consequence, this model is one of the most desirable Epiphones from that period. Even though it's kind of a bare-bones model, they made much fancier ones. This one shows evidence of some well-meaning attempts. The old celluloid binding here has fallen victim to the incipient rot, and someone came along with what seems to have been paint, I'm thinking, obviously in multiple coats, and they basically went to town building it up. But they were so enthusiastic they didn't stop at the edge of the binding channel here, and they encroached into the sides proper. It seems to me actually that the sides have got something like a French polish as well. You know, there's refinishing at play in this guitar. The top is really lovely. That's a beautiful piece of wood. There's a little bit of bear claw in it. Really nice. There's your old Epiphone logo. That's pretty cool. No book-shaped headstock here. Fairly big head. Brazilian rosewood fretboard. Simple dot inlays. Very tasteful, almost austere. The neck, got some issues. I believe it's steel reinforced, but there is not an adjustable truss rod in these. And yeah, frets. I don't like the frets. They're tiny, they're sharp on the ends, they're very uneven, and I don't think there's enough to really flatten it the way I want to. So, 28 thousandths. So they're on the low side, and well, I think we really want to kind of straighten the fingerboard, probably using the neck jig, because, you know, we're going to do a refret, basically. We want good playability out of this. This one is not for show. It needs to work. There's also a tone that makes me wonder what's vibrating. There's a kind of sympathetic ringy buzz happening, which I'm hoping is not a brace. It very well could be a loose spot along the perimeter of the top, especially down the bottom end here. I think the top or the back might not be in complete contact at several points here. So, you know, hopefully that'll go away. There's going to be not one but two different pickups with volume and tone control mounted to a reproduction pick guard, so we won't have to cut into this one to make room for the neck pickup. This whole project is very reminiscent to those old 1920s Gibson L1s and L3s I did a couple of years ago. A lot of work, but they sound really good when they're done, so I'm kind of looking forward to this one. I think I'm going to do something that might be, I don't know, maybe a little counterintuitive, and start off by doing the refret. Simply because the guitar is currently strung up with strings, I'm going to put it in the neck jig. If I go ahead and do the body work first and unstring it, then I got to put strings on again. So this is more efficient. Everything has to get done. It's just a question of when you do it. Checking out the relief in the neck, a little more than I'd like to see. It's around 14 thousandths, around the 6th, 7th fret there. These strings, I believe, are 11 to 52s, which might not be a bad choice for a guitar of this age and composition. I use the notch straight edge as well here. And this of course measures the entire length of the board. It's long enough to reach to the end, so take that into consideration. And yeah, it's about the same, 15 thousandths around the 7th fret, which that's okay, I can dress that out. I can also see that there is a hump around the body joint here, which is kind of expected. These of course are a floating extension. This doesn't actually touch the top at all, except maybe about 1/4 of an inch in the area around the end of the heel here. So there's light all the way down. I can see the dovetail inside there. So that means that this is, it's hinged in one little place. There's not a lot of support under it. So this area tends to, rise and fall with humidity and other things. It's been a while since I've shown the neck jig in a refret situation. Some of you may not have seen it. Basically, it's a way of maintaining the structural geometry of the instrument as it exists under string tension when you take the strings off. Basically locks everything in the way it is, and therefore when I do work on it, it's as if I was working on the guitar with the strings on, which helps in getting a flatter plane of the fingerboard, and kind of accounts for any discrepancies that happen when you put the strings on and exert tension on the guitar. Canadian luthier strikes again. This is a Robertson screw, fairly old one, and the strange thing is it's actually a Robertson yellow, for those of you in the Canadian audience, which is a size that you very, very rarely see. That's, I guess, a Robertson number 0. Had to break out my Robertson yellow screwdriver. This side of the pickguard is held on with a little metal bracket, which is unlike what you would find on a Gibson. So my neck jig is a homemade contraption based pretty closely on an iteration that Dan Erlewine was making in the 1990s. Stuart McDonald, of course, now sells a very nicely constructed one out of metal, which was more than my budget could handle. And since I made this one, I haven't really found a need to purchase the one with all the bells and whistles. It does the job. The guitar is supported around its perimeter with these adjustable felt padded feet, and that support is running along, as I say, where the lining is and the sides meet. So it's not like it's in the center of a plate where if you push down it would cause severe cracking. This is around the edges where the guitar is very strong. And the neck is supported by these padded blocks which rise and fall and are locked in position. I'll set them so it's pretty close to touching the back edge here. And there's also a dial indicator which I can raise to touch the back edge of the neck as well. And don't ask me for plans. If you're going to do this work, you have the mind to figure it out for yourself and probably include some improvements. To hold the body steady, I've got this strap clamp that comes across the waist. There are 2 thick pieces of cardboard wrapped in paper towel. And the strap clamp, of course, has a ratcheting action. This is a good stable neck. With the string tension off, it's only moved about 5/1000ths of an inch. To regain those 5/1000ths of an inch, which is like 0.2 millimeters or something, I have to pull down on the headstock end slightly. I'm watching the gauge on the dial indicator. I'll lock this in place. And now the neck is in the same orientation it would be with the strings on it. So I can take the frets out and dress it. And when I string it back up, I know that I'm going to get a reliable result. Pulling frets. Let's dispel the notion that there are approved or non-approved methods. Maybe you're watching Tanya Spacek, who she always runs a bead of solder across the top of each fret to heat them up. That's the way she learned. She keeps doing it because it, makes her confident and comfortable. I never found it necessary. I get to save on solder cost. That doesn't mean that I'm right and that she's wrong, or vice versa. Or like there are people who put some water on the frets as well, around them, to add some steam to the equation. Again, I've always done them dry, but it's possible the people who use the water find that necessary. It helps them with their particular technique. We're all different. And I think the only wrong way to do it is if you're consistently damaging the fretboard and levering up great big chunks of wood, because that's not inevitable. Some boards are really nasty and uncooperative, but by and large, frets come out pretty clean, if you're patient. Oh, and speaking of other people making guitar videos, my friend Levon Campbell has finally decided he's going to make some long-form ones. I like to think we have some similarity in our humor and sensibilities, so if you like my stuff, you might get a kick out of him building an instrument out of driftwood on the rocky beaches of Vancouver Island. I'll put a link in the description. I'm going to remove the nut, so I'll score around it carefully. This should prevent any glue or lacquer that's adhering to both surfaces from cracking out. A block of wood, some gentle taps, very tight in the slot. This has a very thick head plate overlay, as these things go. It's got to be close to 3 millimeters thick, so it's a fairly deep slot. It also means that there isn't a great disparity in the height between the end of the fingerboard and the head plate itself, so I've got to be careful when I'm sanding. Don't want to bump into that. This has got a 12-inch radius fretboard, which is nice. It's really annoying if it's like 11 1/4. This is a leveling beam with 220 grit sandpaper on it. Couple of ways of approaching this. To maintain a perfect 12-inch radius, this beam would have to, because of the taper in the fretboard, would have to maintain parallel with the center line. So I would start with, most of the beam hanging off on this edge in a straight line all the way across, which can be done. If you're doing this by hand, it's much more intuitive to sort of follow the line of the fretboard, keeping this edge parallel to the outside line of the fretboard. And follow across to the other side, where it's likewise sanding in that direction too, so it's sort of splaying outwards. What this does, in effect, is create something like a compound radius. Not a true compound radius, but something like it. So we end up with a 12-inch radius down on this end, and what might be a 13.5 up towards the top end of the board. This means that each individual string path is straight. The top of the board it's not undulating in any way, but it's not a perfectly true radius, which can actually be beneficial if you've got a player with extremely low action who wants to do a lot of high bending, especially in the upper part of the board. And this is also why when you've got something like a vintage style Fender board with a very tight 7 1/4 inch radius and a pure radius all the way along, that's why we have hard times bending above about the 7th fret. Oftentimes if you go up more than about a tone and a half, because of the way the radius is there, the strings are actually closer to the surface of the frets in the center of the board as they're being bent. I know it's complex, it's hard to describe, but you end up with noting out in that case. And by having this slightly compound radius, we end up alleviating most of those problems. You can see the hump that was up around the body joint of the board here. Now that I've got this top area of the board flattened out, I'm going to add a couple layers of tape here, which is going to act as a standoff for the beam. basically removing more material down at the nut end than at the body end. This is effectively giving us a little tiny bit of a neck reset, raising the bridge slightly because it could use it. And the other thing it's doing is effectively planing in some fall away into this area of the board, which previously was kicking up, as you'll recall. So if I rest that on there, the sanding is not going to touch here, but it will touch on the other end. I'll use my 12-inch radius block with some 220 grit to work on the lower section of the board. Then I'll pull out my 14-inch and do the top 6 or 7 frets. Again, maintaining that weird multi-radius thing. And I'll continue sanding up through the grits until the board takes on a lustrous sheen. I'll break the edges with a file. I'm going to set the guide on my fret saw so it cuts just a hair deeper. We're talking like 0.02 of an inch. I don't want a great big gap under the fret, but there has to be enough clearance for it to go in there and seat nicely. A little drop of oil at this point to act as a resist against the water-based glue. Double checking the amount of relief in the board. There's about 0.08 at this point, which is going to lessen with the compressive nature of the fretting. I use my radius bender to bend the radius into the wire. And I want there to be a little bit more of a gap in the center of the fret than on the ends. I want it to touch on the ends and there to be just a little bit of light if I put it straight on the top of the board like this, so that I know that the ends will be seated good and firmly and less likely to pop up over time. I use my usual combination of my fret press jaws. Clean things up, add some more glue, a hammer to tap in. When I get up to the fingerboard extension, I'll put some wedges under it to provide some extra support. I'll also file off a little bit of the width of the fret barbs to make them go in a little bit easier than on the rest of the board, so I don't have to pound too hard on that unsupported area of the fingerboard extension. The next day, the glue has had a chance to dry, so I can come back and cut the ends of the frets flush with some flush cutting nippers. That doesn't leave them truly flush, of course. I have to come back with a file and touch them up. The file is angled slightly and I can sight down the edge and see the little gap of light between the ends of the frets and the fingerboard. I'll come back with my file holder, which holds the file at an angle. It makes a more precise bevel. Let's talk about fret bevels and fret ends for a minute here. There's been a trend recently in some high-end custom guitars for builders to use a semi-hemispherical fret end. Basically, we turn the end of the fret into what looks like half a hot dog. It's round in profile and in section. When we do that, we really only have the height of the fret to work with to make that little circle. 40 thousandths, 50 thousandths, somewhere around there. A little over a millimeter. And it takes a lot of work to do really neatly. But when it's done right, it looks fantastic. They look really cool. Everyone, your jaw drops when you see them. The thing is, recently, I've had a couple of people come to me to get rid of these, reshape them, basically. And the story is they don't want to take it back to the builder who made them and insult them by being ungrateful for the extra time and effort that was spent into making them, The thing is, if we use a flat angle between the same points on the fret, there's less material protruding above that angle. And depending on your playing style, if you wrap the thumb over the neck, like a lot of people do, it doesn't matter how smoothly the hot dogs have been finished, it can still feel like bumping up against a row of railroad ties, because there's just more fret there, Just something to be aware of. They're not for everyone. I'll level the tops of the frets, which doesn't take long because everything was really flat to begin with. I've sanded a little bit more in the center of the board to introduce the relief I want in the neck, because again, there's no truss rod here. I've got to do it now. So those areas require a little bit more recrowning. I'll blend the contours with some 1200 grit paper, going lengthwise. Then polishing. I'll knock off the corners with a safe edge file. I'll use a very tiny little triangular file to knock off the protruding ends of the fret tang. Flush those up. I'll buff up the ends of the frets and the edge of the board. And there we go. Nice and smooth and easy on the thumb. Nut making time. I'll scribe the line of the top of the frets, and I'll get rid of the excess to about a 1/16 of an inch above the line. I'll mark the string spacing and then give myself some little grooves. That will help the saw to stay on track. And the saw cuts act as a guide for my fret files. Okay, there we have one roughed in nut. Ready for us to proceed next time when we'll get into the rebinding and the installation of the pickups and all that cool stuff. Until then, take care of yourselves.